Okay, welcome. We're going to be talking about how to set up your project for user interface 2. First things first, Training Kit is your best friend. Always start at Training Kit when you're lost. As a new Lambda School student, you might be thinking, where's the link? Where's the project? It should always be available to you in Training Kit. Now, this version actually might change. We've had website updates very quickly here. We try to iterate and get better. In this case right now, for your time here, the project link is going to be directly here on the side. Now, here's a little gotcha though. If your screen is not big enough, we are using responsive design techniques, which is kind of funny. And it goes away if your screen's not wide enough. So if you've seen this the whole time and you were like, where's the project link? You'd have to scroll to the bottom and get the project link. The project link at the very bottom of the page, we can see that we have all these reviews that we can go through. But I think it's just easier to expand this out and hit project, and it should be down here under the project subsection. Okay, so that's one gotcha that you might not have seen this whole time. And don't feel bad if that was you, because I would have felt like, oh my gosh, but if your screen's not big enough, I get it. So in this case, I hit the project button. It takes me to this link. Notice that it says you'll be building a web page based off of design file provided to you. This project has 2 challenges. Build the web page using inline block layout techniques. After you attempt layout with inline block, recreate it with using Flexbox. Now that could be a stretch goal. So we can click this link. It's going to take us to GitHub. GitHub is not Git. Git is the underlying technology that we're using. GitHub is a graphical user interface that allows us to access repositories, which are basically places that we hold code online that other people can access. So this is the Git repo or Git repository for the user interface project. It's titled Great Idea Web Page. Okay? So I want you to start understanding some things now that Git and GitHub are only connected at the business hip. Git, the technology, is separate, and it's in the videos that you've been watching before this class. GitHub is just a graphical user interface. And by the way, I really love GitHub. Not sponsored by them or anything. I just really like their interface. I really like how they do it. Okay, so if we come in here, I want you to understand that we have a folder structure. This folder structure is going to be on your computer soon. So you can actually go through these files and click through them and see them. That's why I love GitHub so much. They have a nice preview system. And you can actually see the file structure. So pro tip, look at your file structure before you download it. This has an awesome way to kind of get familiar with the code base before you bring it onto your computer. Because once it's on your computer, it's going to be inside of your folder structures, and sometimes it's a little overwhelming. So having that here on GitHub first, doing a nice review of the README. So usually repos on the internet, on GitHub, they will have a readme.md. MD stands for Markdown. So Markdown files allow us to write in a certain syntax. Notice it's not markup. So markup is what we write in our HTML, right? Markdown allows us to write in all of these special little syntaxes. So if you were to actually look at the README file properly on your computer, you would see all these little funny symbols that make these headers the way they are. I think that was so confusing to me for a very long time, so I thought I would let you know that there's specifically a file structure for this. Okay. So with the README file, you're supposed to follow things in order. So read the header, be able to create we'll do this all together this one time, and this should set you up for the rest of your time at Lambda School. So being able to create a user interface from scratch based on a design file is considered a basic necessity for front-end developers. We will be building a single-page website using HTML and CSS. Okay. Given this design file using HTML and CSS to build the web page layout, remember, you can only use display inline block and box model CSS properties for this project. Note, you are not permitted to use Flexbox or CSS Grid. This is an exercise in basic layout techniques. Okay, that sucks. So we're limited. We're purposely tying an arm behind our back. and that is to get some basic fundamentals on lock before we move on to the good stuff. Lambda life tip. Okay, this is interesting. Use the code from your instructor's demonstration to help you tackle the objectives. So we were given a code pen earlier, and that code pen should be inside of our cohorts thread. It could be inside of, I think it's inside of the notepad. That might change over time, but there should be some way to access that from your project manager or even the instructor. And it should be in your code pen collection. There's a lot of tips and tricks given to you during the guided demo that apply directly to your project. And it's not by accident. So to get started, fork and clone this project into a directory on your machine. All right, open the code with your preferred integrated development environment, IDE. So that's kind of a scary something. Maybe I'm brand new to development and this is weird. So this is an opportunity to Google stuff. Sometimes you'll see things that are unfamiliar to you. That is when you pop that thing into Google and try to figure out what that is. Ultimately, it's just something that it's a tool that allows us to code. It's a code editor, but oftentimes they're called integrated development environments because you can actually integrate them right into your operating system and run servers and do some crazy stuff with them. So IDEs are a little bit more powerful, a lot more powerful than an average text editor. And then of course, start on the objectives. Okay, so to get started, it says I got to fork and clone first. So I should have watched the video about forking and cloning right after lunch. That's what the instructor said. So let's assume I have that knowledge. Boom. Okay. I now know that I've got to hit the fork button on the repo. So there's a fork button right here. And it says if you hover over it, fork your own copy of Lambda School user interface to your account. Okay. I'm going to hit fork. You already have it. So because I'm the one that created it, it's not gonna, I'm not gonna be able to do that with you. But if you were following along with me, you should see a little animation that occurs, like a little scanning animation with a fork and a book. And then what will happen is it'll go over to your user, which I do have that user. So let me show you what that looks like. Big Nell is my personal account. I'm a large man and my last name's Nell. Big Nell. But you should keep it professional. No Dragon Rider 69s in here. So user interface under Big Nell user. And now inside of this user account, this is my own. This is just Big Nell only. This is under my account. You'll notice that it says forked from Lambda School user interface. So that means that the original owner of this repo is still Lambda School user interface. So basically, I've taken a copy of it and I applied it to my account. That, my friends, is forking, okay? You gain ownership into your GitHub account. Now that I'm on my GitHub account, this is still on the internet, by the way. This is not on my machine. I need to get this down on my machine. In order to do that, I have to hit this big green clone or download button. The reason it says clone or download is because GitHub's awesome and provides many ways for us to get this. For example, you could even download a zip folder if you didn't have access to GitHub on your machine. And in some cases, you need to do this. But because you own your machines, you should have Git installed or have gone through that process after watching the videos. And you should be able to actually get this URL. Notice something interesting. It says clone with HTTPS, or it says use SSH. If you were working in a real-world project that was actually private and protected, you would be using this, cloning with SSH. But we'd have to set up a public key and a private key, and it would be a lot more headache than we need for just setting up a project here for learning. So because we're not concerned about anything like that, we're going to be using HTTPS, which is just a protocol over the internet to get this information from the internet. That's it. SSH is a more secure way of doing that. So make sure, some of you, I've seen in the past, students accidentally hit this, and this will not work because you need all that crazy key stuff set up. So over here, it's not that crazy, but for us, it'd be crazy. Clone with HTTPS right here gives us a URL that would match this. So you can actually hit this clipboard. Let's just pop it into the URL and see what happens. All it does is redirect back to the page. So basically, this is an address pointing back to somewhere where we can download this information. Okay, so all we've done at this point is talked about GitHub, looked at what forking does. Let's get this on my machine. So what I've got to do is I've got to open up my command line interface. And in my case, I use terminal. I'm on a Mac computer. It's just what I like. So I'm going to share my terminal screen and walk through the next steps with you. Okay, here's the terminal screen. We're going to go into greater detail on this on Thursday and understanding what Bash is and how the language is written and all this fun stuff. That's all day Thursday. But for today, you just need to know how to traverse to your folder where you want to have your folder on your machine. So you should have watched the video, like the basic commands on Monday. And maybe not even Monday, because days don't even matter. It's just like, have you watched the video? So in this case, you should know some of the basic commands like ls, cd to change directory. So ls lists all the directories. So I'm going to go ahead and I have a folder called documents. And inside of documents, I have a folder called git. There it is. And then you can see these are all my repos I've got in here. So then I'm going to stay on my Git level. Guys, you could do whatever the heck you want. Just don't put it on your desktop. That's total, I don't like that. That's very unsafe for you. For anybody walking by and accidentally deleting something, desktop's the easiest thing to get to. So at least put your Git stuff one folder deep. That's just a pro tip. Don't put stuff on the desktop, please. Make a folder called Git, whatever. For me, if we look at my full working directory here, it's my user, my JNL user, so I log into my computer, my documents folder, and then I have a Git folder. That's just me, though. You can do whatever the heck you want as long as it's not desktop. Okay, at this point, I'm now going to use my command git clone. So that's part of the Git forking and cloning video that you should have watched before this video. So then we're going to say git clone, and then we've got to put in a URL that we brought in. Now, is this command going to work? What do you guys think? Any issues with this command? Looking good? Let's try it out. Wah, wah, the path already exists. So this might happen to you. Like if you accidentally downloaded it and didn't know you had it, this stuff happens all the time. So one thing I might need to do is delete the folder user interface on my local machine so that I don't have to worry about this. Now, I highly recommend that you do not delete things using your terminal or command line interface. They usually don't have, people aren't usually practiced in using recycle bin or trash bin commands, and they just delete things, and it's permanent. So you don't want to mess with the command line interface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Finder. So let me share my screen. This is just a little debugging tour of things that could go wrong. So if we come in here, we have user interface, and you can see I've already got it. Well, I'm going to delete this from my machine. And I'm going to go back to my terminal and see if I can run that clone command again. So one cool tip is if you hit the up or down arrows on your keyboard while you're in the terminal, it'll remember your last commands. So I'm just going to hit up, and there's my whole command. I don't have to retype that thing, which is great unless you have a typo, which I've done many times in my career. So make sure that your command is clean. All right, I'm going to hit enter and see if this works. All right, look at that. Cloning into user interface. And by the way, it got the folder name from user interface.git, like where I came from. So it automatically created that folder. We don't need to worry about every single line of these, but basically it's unpacking and then putting everything in the right spot. So now, if I go into this folder, and I list out the folder structure, you can now see, look at that. There is the matching information on GitHub. And now I'm ready to start working on my project. So that is the Git clone and ultimately the forking that we did. Tomorrow, you're going to be watching videos that take us even further in this. But I just want you to focus on the simple things today. Even this night might not be very simple. So that's why we're taking time on this. Okay, now I'm going to open up my user interface project in VS Code. I'll share my screen there. Let me get this all set up. Okay, so all I did in a Mac computer is I just dragged my user interface folder to my VS Code icon. Another operating systems, you probably just have to right click and open with. No big deal. However you open it, whatever makes sense to you. All right, here's my VS Code. So here's my README file. Let's see. Oh, I'm not in the right project here. User interface, desktop, great idea. Okay, there we go. So here's the great idea web page. The README file, oh yeah, it is the right file. I just wasn't scrolled up. There we go. So this is the same thing that we were reading before. That's why I told you to get familiar with it on GitHub first. So this wasn't like crazy when you got there. Like it's all familiar, you've seen it before. But now you can see all that crazy markdown stuff that I was talking to you about. This is how we write files in README so that they actually look pretty good on READMEs on GitHub. So if you've ever seen these weird little things like this is just our syntax for writing those markdowns. Pretty cool. But you don't need to worry about that right now. Just understand that if you see this, don't freak out. I know I was like, what the heck is this? Why is there a hash symbol here? And then once I learned it was markdown, I was like, oh, that's cool. All right, so index.html. We've been using CodePen maybe to our detriment because we've been using it so much up until this point that maybe we didn't know how local file systems work. So there's other videos that I've already popped in there. But if we talk about setting up our file just to get started, and then we'll stop this video, so we're almost done here. There's the link tag. I've referenced this like one time in a guided demo in the past, but just in case we haven't, this link tag is an HTML tag. It does have a special href. If you recall, hrefs are hypertext references from our anchor tags. Well, in this case, the hypertext reference is local. Let's talk about that. Local means on your machine. When we start talking about absolute paths, those are URLs that exist off your machine. We have examples of both right in front of us. You can see here, this is an off your machine absolute URL. It's pointing to googleapis.com, CSS, Family Bangers, Trillium Web. This is a font that I've given you to match the design file. So this font family right here is actually being pulled from the internet. So if you didn't have the internet while you worked on this, your font would actually not load correctly. Kind of interesting. But locally, notice our path here is just pointing to our CSS folder and then our CSS file. So this CSS folder is getting pointed to, and then inside of it is our CSS file. And this is, look at this, this is our Eric Meyer reset that we talked about. Also, in addition to the reset, I've provided to you 3 base styles that get you started. Number 1, this should look familiar to you now, box sizing border box on a universal selector. Number 2, I've grabbed the HTML and body tags, and I've set up the height to be 100%, and that's just a little hack I do to allow me to use height 100%. It's nothing you need to be worried about. But the font family, I set it up to be Titilium Web. And then all the headings are set up to be this Bangers font. And so the combination of these 2 font families allow your end result to look like the design file. And then if you might, by the way, if you don't know what letter spacing is or font family, this is an awesome opportunity for you to Google. Don't assume that you'll know everything that you see. Like, take note of the things that are like, what the heck, what's font family? Guys, this is a great time to Google and get better. Like, I purposely put these things in here so that if you hit these little roadblocks, you're not like, oh, that's it, throw your laptop, I don't know CSS anymore. No, you take this stuff, you Google it, and you get better. Like, that's how it works. So these projects aren't just like, do this one thing. It's study the code, learn the things that you don't know, and get better. So that's how this project is set up. The best way to test if this is working is to open it in your browser. So how can you open it in your browser? Well, let me share my folder screen with you, and we'll see how that works. So if we go back to my folder structure over here, you can see I've got my user interface. And notice that the great idea actual working files are nested one folder deep inside of great idea. So what you need to do is you need to open this file, index.html, in your browser. This is how you can preview your work. So you can right-click on it and open with, and then you can pick the browser of your choice. Your default browser will try to come up first, and then you can go down to whatever one you want. I'm going to use Google Chrome. I will now share my screen to Google Chrome. So here's Google Chrome after I opened it up. And you can see this is what the file looks like when you start. It looks like somebody took a train wreck over it, and you're like, well, this is what I'm supposed to work on? Yep, this is your problem you need to solve. So you've been given image assets, you've been given content, you've even been given, like if we inspect this element here, we've been giving you some HTML, but you've got to go through and add this CSS and make it work, make it look like the design file. So what I would like to suggest to you is that you could actually have GitHub open, go to the design files, open up the desktop JPG, and you can use this as a reference if you'd like. Or if you have some kind of image editor or whatever, it doesn't really matter at this point. I just want you to get close enough. I'm going to give you some really cool tips next week on how to make this really easy. But for now, I just want you to use this as a visual reference. So let's build the top navigation together really quick. So here's the top navigation. It's got the logo on the right. It's got the navigation on the left. So how do we accomplish that? So what we're going to do is look at the code here first and go, okay, great idea needs to be over here. And services, product, vision, about us needs to be over here on the left. So we learned about something in class today called inline block that would allow us to stack two elements next to each other without disrupting the flow. So let's go see if we can do that in our code. So I'm going to come back to the code. Here's my HTML. So first things first, study the HTML. Look at your structure. So we've got this big div containing everything called container. Makes sense. We've got a header element. We've got a section down here called CTA. Interesting. We've got another section called main content. We've got another section called contact. And then we've got a footer. Okay, so now that's not so scary anymore. Once you minimize your HTML like this, a lot of the fear of seeing a bunch of code goes away because you're like, oh, it's just a bunch of chunks of code here, and I should just focus on these chunks. If you don't, you'll start getting overwhelmed by how much code, and you'll start, feel that give up feeling. Don't let that give up feeling get to you. Focus on the small chunks. So let's go look at the header. In this case, we've got header, nav, image. Okay, this is really doable. Like, okay, this isn't so scary anymore. Let's look at these big chunks of code here. We have nav, right, and image. So really, I just need to make sure that my nav and my image are both displaying inline block and have constraints from the header above it, right? Okay, so what I can do is open up my index.css and start thinking about how I can work with these together. Now, in VS Code, one of the best things you could do is have code splitting. So right in the middle, you can split your editor like this, and it'll duplicate the thing, and I'll just close the one on the left. And now, and I'll get rid of this navigation system so you can see everything clear. This is pretty nifty. So being able to have an HTML on the left and your CSS on the right is how I prefer to code. Now, I do not ever want to code in a tiny window like this. Usually I have 2 monitors or a giant monitor to work on. I highly recommend to you, if you have the ability to do so, to get a cheap second monitor as a way to hold code. Otherwise, if you're trying to live on like one tiny laptop, you're going to hate your life. After 7 months of staring at that screen, having 2 monitors is a lifesaver for a developer. Okay, so we're going to come down here. This is the beginning of our CSS. Remember how I told you to look at the HTML? All right, so let's start building out some CSS here. I might say container as my starting point. Now the container, if I go back to that design file, now remember, you can go in here and look at your design file. And oh yeah, cool, VS Code has a nice JPEG preview. Not all editors do. If I open this in Sublime, it just is ones and zeros. So this is nice to see this image. So I can see that there are some constraints here. If you watched my other video or haven't watched it yet, I've talked about these constraints and how you can set this up. But basically, we'll just make up a number right now. We'll just say width, 800px, and then we'll say margin, auto. Notice how VS Code's trying to autocomplete a lot for me. Try to avoid autocompleting when you're first starting to write code, just to get that muscle memory of writing things out for yourself. Once you feel comfortable, go ahead and start using the autocompleter. But I think it's really smart of you to avoid it while you're still learning. Okay, so our container now has a width of 800px and a margin auto. Notice that there's a little circle right here. That means I haven't saved yet. I'm going to hit save. Turns into an X. All these little nuances are things that I wish someone had just one time told me. It would have made my life so much easier. Now I'm going to go back to the browser. So if we go to the browser, notice it looks like nothing has changed. That's because I haven't refreshed. I don't have any live reloaders set up on my IDE yet. And that's okay. We're going really basic right now. But if I refresh the browser, let's see what happens. All right. Now I've got my width of 800px and margin auto on my container. Now, if you recall, one of the things I love to do is to put a red border. So instead of jumping back and forth between VS Code again, I'm just going to go into my VS Code and type border 1px solid red on my container. And then all I'm going to do is just refresh the page. Let's see here. Gotta get some of this stuff out of my way. A little harder with the Zoom recording so small. All right, there's that border. So you can see that I've got this border set up. And by the way, this image is telling me that I'm too short. So this image is a good indicator of how wide it should be. So if we inspect this image, we can see the image is actually trying to be constrained inside of there, 876. So don't get caught up in these little moments like this because you're like, what the heck, this image isn't matching. Just make sure that whatever you're doing with your code matches like the design file that you're trying to achieve. This is just practice. You're not getting paid for this. Don't freak out. Use this as a good learning experience. So again, what did I tell you? Focus on the smaller chunks. So let's kind of ignore this image for now. Or we could address it and say, you know what? Maybe I'll make my code 900 wide to fit that image. And then I could adjust the margin later. Those are the kind of things that go through my head when I'm working on a project like this. Okay, last thing. Let's get this navigation looking good. So I've got to get this stuff working. But guess what? Instead of going and goofing around in VS Code, I have an amazing tool. I can come in here and inspect element. And I actually can start using my inspector, my dev tools, to start building my thoughts out first and experimenting without having that frustration of the copy and paste, save, go back to the browser madness. So I can go over here and say, you know what? Let's just try it out. I'm going to go on nav. And notice right here it says element.style. This is awesome because it allows you to style this explicitly, this element, without setting up a class or anything. So you can totally test here. So I can say display inline block. Well, look at that. I'm already going down the right path because now my navigation, which was a block level element before, which you can see right here, is now letting the image logo come up. So that's awesome. Okay, so at this point now I've got to get this thing spread out a little bit more. Well, if you recall, I've got this stuff right here. Well, I don't know the exact spacing because I don't have any kind of tools to help me yet. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it, and that's fine. And so I probably need to go into my A tags, right? Well, my A tags are individual elements. So it might be wise of me to jump down here and try to mess around with the margin because I learned today the box model allows me to move things around with margin. So I'm going to just try 20 pixels of margin and see what happens. So I recall something. A tags are inline elements. So if I use a top margin, it's going to be ignored. But the margins left and right are not ignored. So that's pretty cool. So even if I put a 0 in here, you'll see nothing changes. So now I can start to make some inferences here and go, okay, this A tag does work with 20 pixels. I wonder if I applied it to all the A tags. So what I do now, I come back to my code in VS Code. Now that I've experimented a little bit with this, I'm going to come back to my VS Code and set up a selector. So I come back to my VS Code. I've got my selector over here that I need to build. So always think about that. Think about the selector that you need to build to get the right thing. Now you could keep building off of container, but container is a very generic class. It could be used on 7 pages. So one thing that's not generic is the header, right? Like in this case, the header belongs to just this. And I could use it on several pages as well. So I'm going to say header, nav. I learned that if I did display inline block, that it would work out for me. Like I already tried that out. So that confidence comes in really good on the VS Code, right? Because I already tried it in my developer tools, so I know it works. Like this is a great way to code. Use your developer tools first to inform your VS Code. Then we come into header, nav, a tag, and the a tag we now know could use some margin. So we're going to say margin, but remember this is going to be every a tag and not just one. So I'm going to say top and bottom, it doesn't matter, but I want to use my shorthand, so I'll use my 20 pixels. So if you recall from the notes in class, it was like this. Top and bottom, left and right. That's the shorthand using just 2 values. So now I'm going to save this. Notice I saved it and that went to an X. I'm now going to share my screen. The reason I don't have my whole screen shared is because I got a massive screen and it would just wreck this YouTube video. So that's why I don't do that. I've tried it in the past and it's awful. So over here, I'm going to refresh and I want you to pay attention to what happens. Oh, look at that. Looking good. So now we're getting closer to what we wanted to do here. But notice that we do have a little bit of margin here. So we learned that A tags, if they're inline, don't respect margin, but this nav tag that is controlling everything is a block level element. And actually, it's an inline block level element, and it still respects top margin. So I could actually do this. Margin. Oops. Top. And then I could do like 30px or 50px. And just eyeball what I think is going to look good. See how that works? Pro tip, you can use the up and down arrows to increment by 1. You can see the numbers go up and down, which is super handy. Also, I think you can use shift, and it does increments of 5 or 10. Yeah, 10, that's nice. Pretty cool. So this is really helpful because you can visualize things a lot faster and go, you know what, it looks really good at 35. So then I'm going to just spare you the jumping back between the screen. All I'm going to do is go back to my nav item, and I'm just going to copy and paste this code that I wrote because I can, because technology. And then I'm going to refresh my page, and there we go, looking good. See how this works? It's like a very dedicated piece-by-piece process to get this stuff to start looking good. Now the Great Idea logo is the last piece. So I'm going to inspect this element. Now there's a couple things I could do with this. And that's some of the problem of being a web developer. There's like 8 ways to do the right thing. And oftentimes it just depends on who you're working with and their opinions of things and how they should be. And that's okay. You just got to be able to work with people. Like that's why people skills are invaluable in this industry. So in this case, I can move it over in a couple ways. I could use the box model for sure. So if I used margin, I could use the left margin here and just bump it over 40px, like, then use shift to jump it where I think it needs to go. Isn't that cool? Come over here, 130, looking pretty good. Notice that if I go over the edge, it bumps down to the next line. So be careful about avoiding that edge. So 140 looks like it's going to work, but notice something. Now that I'm 140, if my navigation changes at all, it could bump over the nav too, right? Margin left, do 30px. Uh-oh, right? That's not good. So guess what? We'll solve that problem next week. This week, we can hard code crap like this. But next week, we're going to percent base this so we can actually accomplish all the things I'm talking about without any hacks. So right now, you just need to be able to come over here and say margin left, 40px or whatever it was, 140. And to me, this is pixel close enough. Even though it does not look like the final result that we wanted, like centered, to me, this is great. Like move on, get the project done before the end of the afternoon. So then I'm going to take this margin left. I'll come back to VS Code one more time. Remember, this would all be seamless. I wouldn't be going back and forth between screens like a madman. Like on your screens, it's going to be seamless. Hopefully, all of this will be visible to you and easy to consume at one time. So I've got to figure out how to get that image tag. Well, First off, I'm going to paste that thing I brought over so I don't lose it. Then I've got to think about where am I? Header, image tag. Okay. So here's my header. Cool. So I'm going to make another selector, header. And then notice that I've actually got a class on here called logo. That's super helpful so I don't accidentally grab too many images. Again, this is valid code, or you could type that if you want to be really specific. They both work. Which one's the best? It just depends on where you work. So in this case, margin left, 140 px. I'm going to save it. I will now go back to my screen over here, refresh, and it's stuck now. So I could, if my OCD was in a bad mood, I could say, okay, I want to get centered with that. Oh, no, that thing's not working, right? So that's where you go. I'm not touching that. I'm moving on to the next thing. Like, I don't want you guys to lose sleep. I just want you to get the basics of this thing down. So the next thing you would try to solve is this innovation on demand header. How do you get it to look like this? Well, you've got to get the font size bigger, and you've got to start using the inline block potentially to get these things next to each other. And just keep working down that file till you get done. So that's how you set up this project and work through like the first problem there with the header. I hope that was really helpful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video and then stop the recording. I'll answer any questions you have.